They
I would like to
disrespected his
ask you
mother
what you
on the
meant
plane.
by people
This
like
boy's
her.
courage
I understand
changed
your concern.
everything.
Let's discuss this privately.
ACT-1. She said it loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Not a whisper. Not a private correction. Loud. Deliberate. The kind of loud that isn't about volume at all. It's about audience. It's about making sure that everyone within earshot understands exactly who is in charge and exactly who is not. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to move your bag. And frankly, I'm going to need you to keep it down before this becomes a bigger issue than it needs to be. The woman she said it to didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't give her the reaction she was looking for. She just sat there in seat 22B with her hands folded in her lap and her chin slightly lifted and her eyes carrying something that had no name in polite conversation. That particular dignity that certain people develop after a lifetime of being asked to make themselves smaller in spaces that were never designed with them in mind. Her name was Renee Carter, 37 years old, a registered nurse from Atlanta, Georgia. She had a carry-on bag that was regulation size, a window seat she had paid for, a boarding pass that was completely valid, and a son sitting next to her who was absorbing every single word of this interaction with the focused, quiet intensity of a child who understands more than adults think he does. The son's name was Jaylen, 11 years old, window seat 22A, wearing a navy hoodie with the hood down, sneakers that lit up slightly when he shifted his weight, and an expression on his face that was very, very controlled. The kind of control that doesn't come naturally to 11-year-olds, the kind that gets taught, the kind that gets learned for watching someone you love hold themselves together in public over and over and over again. He was watching the flight attendant. Her name was Karen Whitfield. And I want to say again, because this story insists on it, she was not a monster. She was not twirling a villain's cape. She was an ordinary person doing an ordinary job, moving through a world of frameworks and assumptions and unconscious calculations that she had never once been required to examine out loud. She was 44 years old. She had worked this airline for 9 years. She was efficient, she was professional by most measures, and she had, in this moment, decided something about the woman in 22B without requiring any evidence to support that decision. She had decided that Renee Carter was going to be a problem. She had decided it at the gate. She had decided it during boarding. And she was now 30,000 feet above the state of Tennessee in the process of making that decision visible to everyone within 5 rows. The man in 23C, a broad-shouldered businessman named Dale, who had the laptop and earbuds energy of someone who considered a flight primarily an inconvenience to his productivity, glanced up from his screen. He looked at Renee. He looked at Karen. He made a fast, quiet assessment and went back to his laptop. The elderly woman in 21I, soft white hair, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a paperback mystery novel face down on her tray table, was not going back to her novel. She was watching. Her expression was unreadable, but her attention was total. The young man in 22C, mid-20s, first time on a plane, judging by the white-knuckle grip he had maintained on his armrest since takeoff, looked from Karen to Renee to Jaylen and back again with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone who could feel that something was wrong but hadn't yet decided what to do with that feeling. And Jaylen sat in seat 22A with his hands on his knees and his jaw set and his eyes tracking Karen Whitfield's every movement with a precision that was, in its own way, extraordinary. He was waiting. He was thinking. He was deciding. And what he decided, what that 11-year-old boy chose to do in the next several minutes, in front of a full cabin of strangers at 30,000 feet, would be the kind of thing that people talk about for years. The kind of thing that finds its way into the stories people tell about the moments that changed how they thought about courage, about voice, about what it means to stand up for someone you love when the world is watching and the world is not sure it's on your side. But to understand what Jaylen did, you need to understand who he was before this flight. You need to understand where he and his mother were going and why, and what it had taken just to get to this gate on this Tuesday morning. You need to understand what Renee Carter had been carrying long before she ever set foot on this plane. And you need to understand the one thing she had told him, one specific thing said on one specific night, that was running through his mind right now, in this moment, as he sat very still and watched a woman in a uniform use her voice like a weapon against his mother. Stay with me. because this story is about a lot of things. But mostly it's about what happens when a child decides that love is louder than fear. And it starts here, right here, in seat 22A. Before we go any further, have you ever watched someone you love get disrespected in public and had to decide in that moment whether to speak up or stay quiet? What did that feel like in your body? Drop it in the comments right now. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell stories that get into your chest and stay there. This one especially. Airplane Act 2. Renee Carter had been awake since 4:30 in the morning. Not because of the flight, though the flight was early, brutally early, the kind of departure time that requires you to set an alarm for a time that doesn't feel like it belongs to the waking world. She had been awake before the alarm. She had been lying in the dark of her bedroom in the small house she rented in the East Point neighborhood of Atlanta, staring at the ceiling with the specific wakefulness of someone whose mind had too much running through it to permit the luxury of sleep. She had been thinking about her mother. Her mother's name was Dorothy Carter, 72 years old, living alone in a second-floor apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the same city where Renee had grown up, in a neighborhood that had changed so much around Dorothy that she sometimes joked she was the last original resident on her block, though the joke had an edge to it, the edge that jokes get when they're true. Dorothy had been diagnosed 14 months ago. Breast cancer, stage 2, caught late enough to matter, but early enough that the doctors had looked at Renee with the particular expression that means we have options. They had exercised those options. Surgery, a course of treatment that had taken Dorothy's hair and 30 pounds and a significant portion of her energy, though none of her spirit, which remained fully intact and occasionally combative in the way that Renee had always loved and occasionally found exhausting. The treatment had ended 6 weeks ago. Dorothy was in what her oncologist called the monitoring phase, a phrase that Renee, as a nurse, understood in its full clinical complexity, which was both reassuring and not reassuring at all, depending on which part of her brain was doing the thinking. She was going to see her mother. She had been trying to make this trip for 4 months. Shifts had moved. Childcare had fallen through twice. A water heater had failed spectacularly in December and consumed the money she had set aside for the flight. And then there had been a car repair, and then Jaylen had needed new glasses, and then February had been hard in the specific way that February is hard when you're a single parent running on a nurse's salary with no backup and no margin for error. But she had made it. She had put this flight on her credit card on a Wednesday night and told herself she would figure out the balance later. And she had packed a bag and packed Jaylen's bag and told him they were going to see Grandma Dorothy. And Jaylen had put down his book about deep-sea creatures and said, with the solemnity of someone twice his age, "Is she going to be okay?" And Renee had said, "She's fighting, and she needs to see us," which was not quite an answer to the question, but it was the truest thing she could say. Jaylen had nodded. He had gone back to his room and begun packing with complete self-sufficiency. No list required, no reminders about toothbrushes or chargers. He had been doing that since he was 8. Self-sufficient in the particular way of children who have watched a parent manage everything alone and have decided, somewhere deep in their character, that they will not be an additional weight to carry. He was that kind of child. His teachers had been saying it since kindergarten, in various formulations that all pointed at the same thing. Jaylen notices. Jaylen thinks before he speaks. Jaylen asked a question in class today that I had to look up before I could answer. His third-grade teacher had called Renee specifically to tell her that during a science lesson about weather systems, Jaylen had identified an inconsistency in the textbook diagram that the teacher herself had never caught. He was in 5th grade now. He read at a 9th grade level. He had a particular passion for systems, how things worked, why they worked the way they worked, what happened when one part of the system failed. He also had his mother's eyes, calm, deep, always reading the room. And the room, on this Tuesday morning, had started reading badly before they even got to security. The cab driver had been fine. The check-in kiosk had been fine. The security line had been long, but manageable, though a TSA officer had pulled Jaylen's backpack for additional screening, a moment that Renee had navigated with the practiced, bone-deep composure of a woman who has been navigating those moments her entire adult life. She had stood very still while they went through his bag and found nothing of note, because there was nothing of note, because there had never been anything of note, because there never was. Jaylen had stood still too. He had watched the officer go through his things with those steady, reading eyes, and he had said nothing, and when they handed the bag back, he had simply put it on his shoulders and walked with his mother to the gate. He had asked no questions about it. He had not needed to. He understood more than Renee sometimes wanted him to understand. At the gate, they had sat together and shared a breakfast sandwich that Renee had bought from a kiosk, splitting it evenly the way they always split things, a habit built from years of making things stretch. Jaylen had asked about Grandma Dorothy. Renee had told him about the last phone call, the one where Dorothy had been more energetic than previous ones, where she had made 2 jokes and complained about her neighbor's dog with the full-throated investment of someone whose spirits were genuinely lifting. Jaylen had smiled. A real one. She's going to want to play cards, he said. She's going to cheat at cards, Renee said. She always cheats. She says it's strategy. It's cheating. And they had laughed. Quietly there in the gate area, 2 people who love each other in the specific, unguarded way of a parent and child who have been through a lot together and have come out the other side still laughing about the same things. This was who they were before the plane. Before Karen Whitfield. Before the loud voice and the public correction and the words that landed like small, precise injuries in front of a full cabin of witnesses. This was the trip. This was the reason. A mother trying to reach her mother. A son trying to take care of the woman who had spent his entire life taking care of him. And Dale in 23C had looked up at them during boarding and made a calculation in 3 seconds. And Karen Whitfield had seen them at the gate and made a calculation in less than that. And the flight had begun. And now, at 30,000 feet, those calculations were sitting in the middle of a plane full of people who were about to discover that they had made a mistake about who was in seat 22A and seat 22B. Engagement question. Jaylen has been watching his mother navigate these moments his whole life, staying composed, absorbing things that should never have to be absorbed. Do you think children understand more about what's happening around them than adults give them credit for? I genuinely want to know. Drop your answer below. And subscribe right now if you haven't, because this story is about to shift in a way you won't see coming. Warning Act 3. The plane lifted off the runway at 7:14 in the morning, and for the first 40 minutes of the flight, everything was ordinary. The ordinariness was almost beautiful in hindsight, the way ordinary things are beautiful when you know they're about to end. The seatbelt sign went off with its familiar chime. The drink cart started its way down the aisle. The pilot came on with the standard update about cruising altitude and expected arrival time, his voice carrying that particular authority-warmed hybrid that good pilot's perfect, the voice that says we're in good hands without needing to say it directly. Renee had her earbuds in one ear. She was listening to a playlist she had made specifically for travel, unhurried music, the kind that creates a bubble of private space even in a crowded cabin. With her free hand, she was holding a small spiral notebook, writing a list of things she wanted to do with Dorothy during the visit. She wrote slowly, thinking about each item, savoring the planning of it. Cook Sunday dinner together. Watch the old movies Dorothy loved that Renee had never made time to sit through. Take Jaylen to the park where Renee had played as a girl. Show him the school she had attended. Give him the physical geography of where he came from. Jaylen had his book, the Deep Sea Creatures book, which had been with him for 3 weeks now and showed no signs of being finished because Jaylen read the same books multiple times and could not be rushed through them. He was currently on a section about anglerfish, the bioluminescent lure, the extraordinary pressure tolerances, the pitch-black world 3 miles below the ocean surface where light had never reached and life had invented itself in complete independence from the sun. He found this fascinating in a way he found difficult to fully explain to people who asked, though he had tried. It's like he had told his mother once, there's this whole other world that exists completely separately from ours, and the things that live there figured out how to survive in the darkest possible place. And she had looked at him and said quietly, yes, baby, some things are built for exactly that. He hadn't been sure if she was still talking about the fish. The woman in 21 had introduced herself shortly after takeoff. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, 71 years old, though she delivered this information with the casual confidence of someone who has made peace with every single one of those years. She was traveling to Philadelphia to visit her daughter, she said. First grandchild on the way. She had the bright, slightly overwhelmed happiness of a woman who has been waiting for this particular joy and cannot quite believe it has arrived. She had smiled at Jaylen with the specific warmth that certain older people extend to children. Genuine, unhurried, the smile of someone who has grandchildren of their own or wishes they did. She had asked him what he was reading. He had told her about the anglerfish. She had listened with real attention and then said, "That sounds like something worth knowing about." And Jaylen had looked at her and decided, in the way he decided things about people, that he liked her. Now, at the 40-minute mark, when the drink cart had passed and the cabin had settled and Jaylen was technically reading but was actually also listening to the specific quality of the cabin around him, Karen Whitfield came back through the aisle. And this time she stopped. She stopped at row 22. She looked at the overhead bin above seats 22A and 22B, and she said, in that carrying, public voice, "Ma'am, is this your bag?" Renee took out one earbud. "Yes," she said. "It's not stored correctly. The handle needs to go in first. It's blocking the bin from fully closing." Renee looked up. The bin was closed. She could see that it was closed. Every person within 3 rows could see that it was closed. "I'm sorry," Renee said, with the practiced patience that was not patience at all, but its more exhausted cousin. "It looks closed to me." Karen reached up and opened the bin. She moved the bag approximately 2 inches. She closed the bin. "There," she said, as if she had solved a significant problem. "You need to pay attention to these things. It's a safety issue." Eleanor in 21A had lowered her paperback. Dale in 23C had not looked up, but his typing had slowed. Renee said, "Thank you," with the particular flatness of a thank you that means something different from thank you. Karen moved on, and Jaylen sat in 22A and felt something shift in his chest. Something that was not quite anger. Anger was too simple for what it was. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of watching someone use a legitimate-sounding reason to do an illegitimate thing. Of watching process be weaponized against a person. Of watching his mother absorb it with that terrible practice calm that Jaylen had been watching his whole life and that he loved and hated at the same time. Loved because it was dignity, hated because it was necessary. He put his book face down on his lap. He looked out the window. He thought about what his mother had told him. Not recently. A year ago, on a night when something similar had happened in a different context. A store, a security guard, a question that should not have needed asking. And they had driven home in the particular silence of people processing something that doesn't have clean edges. And Renee had sat at the kitchen table after she thought he was in bed. And he had come downstairs for water, and she had looked at him, and instead of sending him back to bed, she had said, "Sit down for a minute." And she had told him something. Something about dignity. About the difference between swallowing something and surviving it. About the fact that the world would try, in various ways and with various tools, to make him question the value of his own voice. And that the most radical thing he could do, the most powerful, the most protective, the most dangerous to every system that wanted him small, was to refuse to let that happen. She had said, "Your voice is real. What you see is real. Don't let anyone take that from you." He had been 10 when she said it. He was 11 now. He was thinking about it now. Engagement question. Karen used a professional tone and a legitimate-sounding reason to do something that was not legitimate at all. Has anyone ever done that to you? Kept it technically polite while making the disrespect absolutely clear? That specific thing. Drop it in the comments, because I think far more people have been there than will admit it. Subscribe and stay with this, because what's coming next is the moment everything accelerates. ACT 4. It got worse. That's the thing about these situations. They rarely stay at one temperature. They either cool down or they escalate, and the direction they go depends almost entirely on whether the person applying the heat decides they've made their point or decides they haven't made enough. Karen Whitfield had not made her point enough. 20 minutes after the bag incident, she came back through the aisle, this time with a purpose that the experienced eye, and Eleanor Marsh had a very experienced eye, could identify before a word was spoken. There was a quality to her approach, a specificity of destination. She was not coming through on a general pass. She was coming to row 22. She stopped at Renee's row. She looked at Renee with the professional smile that had been doing so much heavy lifting on this flight. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again. We've had a system issue, and I need to re-verify some seat assignments in this section." Renee looked at her. "Which seats are you re-verifying?" A pause. "Just some in this section." "Which one specifically?" Karen's professional smile held. "It's routine. If I could just see your pass." "Have you checked the other passengers in this section?" Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "I'm working through them." Eleanor in 21A said, clearly and without drama, "She hasn't asked me." The cabin around them had gone very quiet in the particular way that cabins go quiet when something worth paying attention to is happening. Dale had stopped typing. Tyler had let go of his armrest. 3 rows forward, a woman had paused her movie and was watching through the gap between the headrests. Renee looked at Karen for a moment. Then she unlocked her phone and pulled up her boarding pass and held it out. Karen looked at it. There was nothing wrong with it. There had never been anything wrong with it. She handed the phone back and said, "Thank you. Sorry for the inconvenience," and moved to leave. And that was when she said it. She had turned half away, already moving, already transitioning back to the performance of routine, when she said it over her shoulder, and the over-the-shoulder delivery was the most revealing thing about it, because it was designed to land without full accountability, without direct eye contact, in a deniable space of word that could later be characterized as misheard or misunderstood. She said, "People like you really should read their tickets more carefully before they board. It saves everyone a lot of time. People like you." 3 words, wrapped in the professional vocabulary of customer service, delivered in the measured tone of someone who knew exactly how to say a thing while maintaining the technical ability to claim they hadn't meant it the way it sounded. People like you. The cabin heard it. Every person within 8 rows heard it. The woman who had paused her movie heard it. Dale heard it, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor Marsh heard it and set her paperback down completely and did not pick it up again for the rest of the flight. Tyler heard it and looked at Renee, and then looked at his hands. And Jaylen heard it. Jaylen, who had been sitting with his book closed on his lap for the last 20 minutes, who had been very still and very quiet and very present in the way he was always present. Jaylen heard those 3 words and felt something happen in his chest that he would later describe to his grandmother as, like when a door you've been holding shut finally gets pushed open from the other side. Renee went still. Not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a woman who has developed, over 37 years, an extraordinary capacity for not giving people the reaction they are looking for. She sat with her hands folded and her chin up and her face carrying that terrible, dignified composure. And she said nothing, which was the most disciplined thing in the world, and the most heartbreaking, because Jaylen could see, he could always see, what the composure was covering. He had grown up reading his mother's silences the way other children read books. He knew the difference between the silence that meant she was at peace and the silence that meant she was absorbing something painful and refusing to let it break her in public. He knew exactly which one this was. He looked at his mother's profile, the slight tension at the corner of her jaw, the way her hand was folded just a little too carefully. He looked at Karen Whitfield's retreating back. He looked at Eleanor, who was looking at him with eyes that said, "I see this. I know what this is. And whatever you're deciding right now, I'm paying attention." He looked at Dale, whose jaw was tight and whose eyes were on his laptop screen, but whose typing had not resumed. He looked at Tyler, who was looking at him with that wide, uncertain expression that Jaylen now recognized not as indifference, but as someone who doesn't know what to do with what they've just witnessed. And then Jaylen looked at his mother one more time, and his mother turned and looked at him, and her eyes were steady, and her expression was composed. And underneath all of it, in the place she could never quite fully hide from him, she looked tired. Not tired like sleepy, tired like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. And something in Jaylen Carter settled. Not hardened, settled. The way something settles when a decision gets made that was always going to get made. He unclipped his seatbelt, Renee looked at him immediately. "Baby, I need to say something," he said, quietly, just to her. She looked at his face. She did the calculation that she always did, reading him, taking the temperature, figuring out what was underneath the composure. And what she found there was not anger, not the dangerous, uncontrolled heat that she had spent 11 years teaching him would not serve him. What she found was something different, something that took her breath slightly, because she recognized it. She recognized it because she had worked very hard to put it there. It was dignity. It was his voice finding its legs. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, very quietly, "Okay." Jaylen stood up. Engagement question. 3 words. People like you. At what exact moment in this story did you feel the most anger? Was it the bag, the ticket check, or those 3 words? Tell me precisely where you felt it, and tell me what you would have done if you were sitting in that cabin. Because I think most of us have been Dale, and I think that's worth being honest about. Drop it below and subscribe, because what Jaylen says next is the reason this entire story exists. ACT 5. He didn't raise his voice. That's the first thing to understand about what happened next. There was no shouting, no dramatics, no performance of outrage designed for an audience. Jaylen Carter stood in the aisle of that plane and spoke the way his mother had taught him to speak, from the truth, with his full voice, without apology and without escalation. He said, "My name is Jaylen Carter. I'm 11 years old. My mother's name is Renee Carter. She is a nurse. She has worked at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta for 9 years. She woke up at 4:30 this morning to bring me on this flight so we could visit my grandmother, who has been sick for over a year and who we haven't been able to visit because my mother has been working to keep our family going while also helping my grandmother from 500 miles away." He paused, not for effect, just to breathe. "Since we got to the gate this morning, you have asked my mother to verify her seat 3 times. You told her she stored her bag incorrectly when it was closed completely. You checked her boarding pass twice when you did not check the other passengers in our section. And then you said that people like her should read their tickets before they board." Another pause. "I would like to ask you what you meant by people like her." The cabin absorbed this. The absolute, ringing silence of a question that does not need to be answered to do its work. Because the work is already done. Because the question itself is the accusation. Because every person within 20 rows heard it and knew exactly what it meant and felt the weight of it settle on them in different ways, depending on who they were and what they had done and not done in the last 40 minutes. Karen Whitfield's face did something complicated. The professional smile slipped. Not completely, not dramatically, just slightly. The way a mask slips when the person behind it has been surprised by something they weren't prepared for. She had expected tears, maybe, or the wavering voice of a child who had started something too big and was now regretting it. She had not expected this. This steadiness, this precision, this complete, quiet command of the space. She said, "I wasn't implying anything. I heard what you said," Jaylen said. Not loudly, just firmly. "The passengers around us heard what you said. And my mother heard what you said. And she didn't respond to it because she has spent her whole life being very careful about how she responds to things, in public especially, because she knows that if she reacts the way she has every right to react, it will be used against her. And I know that too. I have watched her do that my whole life. And I think that is one of the saddest and most unfair things I know." Eleanor Marsh made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The involuntary sound that comes out of people when something true lands in them with enough force to get past the protective layers. Dale had his laptop closed. He was looking at Jaylen with an expression that contained something that was in the process of rearranging itself. Tyler had tears at the edges of his eyes that he was very clearly not acknowledging. And Jaylen was not finished. "My grandmother is sick," he said. "And my mother has been scared about that for a long time. And she worked really hard to get us on this flight today. And she's the best person I know. She is kind to everyone she takes care of at work. She treats every patient with respect, including patients who don't treat her with respect back. She does that because she believes that's who she should be." He looked at Karen directly. "And she deserves to be treated the way she treats people." He sat back down. He did not look around for reactions. He did not check the faces of the surrounding passengers to assess how he had done. He sat down, and he looked at his mother. And Renee Carter's eyes filled. She did not cry. She held it. Because some habits are too deeply carved to release in public, even in the most moving moment. But her eyes were full, and she looked at her son, and she said, very quietly, just for him, "Baby." And he took her hand. The cabin was silent for a long moment. The specific silence that follows something true. The silence that people carry out of moments like this and feel for days afterward without always being able to articulate why. And then Eleanor Marsh spoke. She did not stand up. She did not make a speech. She turned in her seat and said, in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who has been around long enough to have no patience for injustice, "That child just said something that needed saying." And I believe the rest of us in this section owe this family an acknowledgement that we heard him. She looked at Dale. Dale looked back at her. He looked at Renee. He looked at Jaylen. He said, "She's right." It came out slightly rough, like it had to get past something. "She's right. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." Tyler said, "Me too." Almost a whisper, but real. The woman 3 rows up leaned around the headrest and said, "I heard it too. All of it. I'm sorry." And Karen Whitfield stood in the aisle and felt the experience of being held fully accountable by the collective witness of everyone around her. Not through anger, not through aggression, but through the simple, devastating act of everyone seeing exactly what had happened and saying so out loud. Engagement question. When Jaylen sat back down and took his mother's hand, what did you feel in that moment? I want you to try to describe it exactly, because I think what happens in us when we watch a child do something that brave is one of the most specific feelings there is. Drop it below and subscribe right now, because what walks through that galley door next changes everything about this story. ACT 6. His name was Captain David Osei, not the captain of the flight. That was Captain Briggs, currently in the cockpit and unaware of what was happening in rows 21 through 26. David Osei was a deadheading pilot, traveling off-duty, repositioning to another city for his next assignment. He had been sitting in 19B for the entire flight with his uniform jacket folded across his lap and his eyes closed, or apparently closed, in a specific way of airline crew who have learned to rest in any available window of time. He had not been asleep. He had heard the bag incident. He had heard the ticket check. He had heard those 3 words. And he had heard every word that Jaylen Carter had just spoken with the complete, practiced attention of a man who spends his professional life in environments where missing something has consequences. He was 53 years old. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 26 years. He was a captain at this airline, this specific airline, the one whose uniform he was currently wearing, with a record that his colleagues described as distinguished and his supervisors described as exemplary. He had a daughter who was 13. He had a son who was 9. He had navigated, over the course of his career and his life, more iterations of what Renee Carter had just experienced than he could count with accuracy. He stood up. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the aisle. He looked at Karen Whitfield, and Karen looked at him, at his uniform, at the 4 stripes on the epaulets that had been folded out of view under his jacket until this moment. And her face changed in a way that went beyond the complication of the last few minutes into something more fundamental. "Captain Collins," he said, using her last name with the specific professional precision of a colleague and superior, "I've been sitting in row 19 for the duration of this flight." A pause that contained a great deal. "I need you to get me the senior cabin supervisor, and I need you to pull the incident log for this flight segment." Karen stood very still. "Captain Osei, I also need you to understand," he continued, in the same measured tone that carried with absolute authority through the silent cabin, "that what I witnessed in this cabin today will be documented in full. Not as a complaint, as a report. Because what happened here happened to a passenger on this airline's aircraft, and this airline has policies that exist specifically to prevent what I witnessed." He looked at Renee. He said, "Ma'am, I apologize on behalf of this airline for your experience on this flight. You should not have been treated this way. Your son," he paused, looked at Jaylen. "Your son demonstrated more grace and more courage than most adults I know. And I want to make sure that is on the record." Renee looked at him. Her eyes were still full. She said, "Thank you." He nodded. He looked at Jaylen. "Young man, How old are you? 11, Jaylen said. Captain Osei nodded slowly. I have a son who's 9, he said. I'm going to tell him about you when I get home. Jaylen looked at him. What will you tell him? The captain considered this. That standing up for the people you love, doing it calmly, doing it truthfully, doing it in front of people who might not respond well. That's one of the hardest things there is. And that today, I watched an 11-year-old do it better than most grown men would. The cabin was still. Completely, utterly still. And then the woman in 18A, who nobody had heard from the entire flight, who had been invisible in the way that certain passengers are invisible, raised her hand slightly. I'm sorry, she said. I need to say something. Everyone looked at her. I have a recorder on my phone, she said. I started recording when the bag situation happened because something felt wrong. I have the entire second interaction on video, including, she paused, the words that were said. The quality of the silence changed. Karen Whitfield looked at the woman, then at Captain Osei, then, briefly, at the floor. Jaylen 23C stood up. He looked at Renee and he said, I'm going to be honest with you. I made a decision about this situation when you boarded, and I made it in about 3 seconds, and I made it wrong. I'm a senior partner at a law firm. I spend my professional life telling other people to stand up for what's right, and then I sat here for 40 minutes and did nothing. I'm sorry. That is not acceptable, and I know it. He looked at Jaylen. What you did took courage. I want you to know that I see that. Renee looked at Dale for a long moment. She did not perform forgiveness. She did not rush to make him comfortable. She simply said, thank you for saying that. Eleanor turned to Jaylen and said, with the simplicity of someone who has been alive long enough to cut straight to what matters, your mother raised you right, and you honored her today. Remember this. Remember exactly what you did and how it felt, because the world is going to try many times to tell you that your voice doesn't matter. And today you prove that it does. Captain Osei turned to Karen. His voice was quiet, professional, but underneath it was something genuine. You have some decisions to make, he said, about what you're going to do with this moment. I'd encourage you to make the right ones. He walked to the front galley, and Karen Whitfield stood alone in the aisle with the recording and the witnesses and the senior captain's report and the weight of what she had done pressed against her from every direction. And the thing that pressed hardest, though she could not have articulated this immediately, was not the professional consequence. It was the image of an 11-year-old boy standing in an airplane aisle, speaking clearly and without hatred about his mother, and the recognition, sudden, complete, impossible to unsee, that she had been the reason he had to. Engagement question. When Captain Osei stood up and revealed who he was, what did you feel? Relief? Satisfaction? Something more complicated than either of those? And here's the harder question. Dale sat in that cabin for 40 minutes and said nothing until it was safe to speak. Do you forgive him for eventually doing the right thing? Or does the silence matter just as much as the words? Be honest. Drop it below. And subscribe, because the final act of this story contains the most emotional moment of everything you've just watched. ACT 7. The plane landed at Philadelphia International Airport at 11:47 in the morning. The descent had been quiet, not the silence of tension. The tension had passed, or rather it had transformed into something different, something more complex and more livable. The silence of people who have witnessed something significant and are in the process of integrating it. Karen Whitfield had spent the last 30 minutes of the flight in the forward galley. She had spoken with the senior cabin supervisor. She had spoken with Captain Osei. She had filed, at his direction, a self-initiated incident report, a document that required her to describe, in her own words, the events of the morning and her role in them. She had written it carefully. She had not minimized, and she had not dramatized. She had written it the way you write something when you're trying to be honest with yourself on paper. It was one of the harder things she had done in 9 years of this job. When the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Karen Whitfield walked to row 22. She stood in the aisle. Renee looked up at her. Karen said, Mrs. Carter, I owe you an apology. Not a professional courtesy apology. A real one. She paused. She was choosing words the way people choose words when they know that the wrong ones will be worse than silence. What I said to you is wrong. The way I treated you from the moment you boarded was wrong. I made assumptions about you that I had no basis for, and I acted on those assumptions in a way that caused you harm. I am sorry." She looked at Jaylen. "And Jaylen," she said, "his name, not Sweetie, not Han, his name, what you said to me, how you said it, I want you to know that it landed. I'm going to be thinking about this day for a long time, and I want to thank you, because what you said needed to be said, and you said it with more dignity than I deserved." Jaylen looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I hope you have a good rest of your day," which was, somehow, the most complete response available. Eleanor pressed a small cream-colored card into Jaylen's hand as she gathered her things. Her name and number. "My daughter is expecting her first baby," she said. "And I have been thinking, since you stood up in that aisle, about what kind of world I want that baby to grow up in. You reminded me today that the world I want is possible. Keep being who you are." Dale stopped at the row on his way out. "If there's anything you need, documentation of a witness statement, anything that would help you pursue this formally, I want to be involved." He put his card on the tray table. "No obligation, but I meant it." Tyler stopped too. He looked at Jaylen. "I've never spoken up like that for anyone in my life. I sat there and I didn't say anything, and I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time." He looked at Jaylen. "You showed me something today. Thank you." Jaylen looked at him. "You said something afterward," he said. "That counted." Captain Osei shook Renee's hand at the front galley. He shook Jaylen's hand. A real handshake, adult to adult, with full regard. He said, "Safe travels. I hope your grandmother is feeling well." Renee said, "Thank you for what you did." He said he did it first. They walked up the jetway and into the terminal. Renee stopped at the first bench she saw. She sat down. She put her bag on the floor. She put her face in her hands. Not crying, just stopping. For the first time since 4:30 in the morning, just stopping. Jaylen sat beside her. He put his hand on her back. After a moment, she looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she was composed. Always, always composed. And she looked at her son with an expression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not pride exactly. Something deeper than pride. The look of a person who has been fully, completely seen by someone they love. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Where did you learn to talk like that?" He looked at her. "From you," he said simply. She put her arms around him and held him in the middle of that busy terminal while people moved around them in every direction. She held her son, and she felt, moving through the exhaustion and the relief and the enormous tenderness of the moment, something she recognized as grace. Not the grace that gets given to you. The grace that gets built, slowly, imperfectly, over years of small choices and hard mornings and conversations at kitchen tables and the daily, demanding work of raising a person who knows who he is. Dorothy Carter was waiting at the arrivals hall. She was thinner than the last time, but she was standing. She had insisted on standing, had refused her daughter's suggestion of a wheelchair pickup with a full-throated dismissal she reserved for suggestions she considered unnecessary. She was standing in a blue coat with her handbag over one arm and her eyes already scanning the arrivals door. When she saw them, her face opened up completely. All the caution and the weariness and the careful management of a difficult year just dissolved, and what was underneath was pure, simple, overflowing happiness. Jaylen ran. He covered the last 20 feet at speed and arrived in his grandmother's arms, and Dorothy held him with both arms and pressed her face into the top of his head and said something that nobody else could hear, something just for him between a grandmother and the grandson she had not seen in too long. Renee walked up, and Dorothy's free arm came out and pulled her in two, and the three of them stood there in the arrivals hall of Philadelphia International Airport, holding each other, while the world moved around them with all of its noise and motion and ordinary urgency. That evening, around Dorothy's kitchen table, Dorothy heard the story. She listened with her hands folded and her eyes on Jaylen's face, and she did not interrupt once. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what your great-grandmother used to say?" Jaylen shook his head. Dorothy said, "She used to say that the most dangerous thing a black child can know is that their voice is real. Dangerous to every system that wants them small. Dangerous to every assumption that wants them quiet. She said, know that your voice is real, and then use it carefully and use it truly. And nothing in this world can take that from you. She reached across the table and took Jaylen's hand in both of hers. You used your voice truly today, she said. Your great-great-grandmother would have stood up and clapped. Jaylen smiled. A real one. Full and uncomplicated. Would she have cheated at cards? He asked. Dorothy looked at him. Then she laughed, really laughed, the full, round laugh of a woman whose spirit had survived everything thrown at it and was fully, magnificently intact. Absolutely, she said. Captain David Osei filed his full report the next morning. The documentation from the cabin supervisor and the passenger recording were included. The airline's review process was initiated within 48 hours. Karen Whitfield was placed in a retraining program. She later requested a conversation with her supervisor, not one she was required to attend, but one she asked for. She talked about the frameworks she had built, the assumptions she had never examined, the way years of professional experience had taught her to read situations quickly without ever asking her to question whether her reading was correct. She said, I want to be the kind of person who would have listened the first time. Her supervisor said, that's where it starts. Jaylen went back to school 2 weeks later. His teacher, Ms. Patterson, pulled him aside after class. When he finished telling the story, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what made you decide to stand up? He thought about it. I thought about all the times she had to stay quiet, he said. And I thought about the fact that I didn't have to. And I thought, if I have a voice and I don't use it, that's a choice too. And I didn't want to make that choice. Ms. Patterson looked at him for a long moment. She said, Jaylen, don't ever stop being who you are. He nodded. He went back to his seat. He opened his book about deep-sea creatures. He found his page. And somewhere beneath the reading, beneath the pages about bioluminescence and pressure and the extraordinary adaptations of things that live in darkness, he was already noticing the next thing, already listening, already filing it away with the patience and the precision that was simply, fundamentally, irreducibly who he was. Because that is what some people are built for. Not the loudness of it, not the recognition, the work of it, the daily, quiet, invisible work of paying attention and speaking truly and refusing to let the world convince you that your voice is less than it is. Jaylen Carter was 11 years old. He had stood in an airplane aisle at 30,000 feet and told the truth about his mother. And the truth had done what truth does when it is spoken clearly by the person who has the most right to speak it. It had changed the room. Final engagement question. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to sit with it before you answer. Who in your life is sitting with something they've been absorbing in silence? Something they should never have had to absorb? And what would it mean to them if you stood up in the aisle? You don't have to name them. Just say, I know who it is. Drop that in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, not tomorrow, today. Subscribe and hit the bell because we're going to keep telling these stories for as long as they need to be told. And they need to be told for a long time yet. Thank you for watching all of this. Thank you for being here. See you on the next one.